Hi there everyone! For this video we're going to be wrapping up our coverage of the Presocratics. Now one concern that you might have is we're moving into the semester, right? We're only a couple of weeks in, right? We've spent some time examining some of the basic aspects of the Presocratics views, right? But as you might have noticed, there's like a lot of them, right? There's very many philosophers that you're being asked to read only in a couple of weeks. And, obviously this is in part simply explained by the very small amount of material that we have from each of them. But another aspect of covering, quite a lot of these philosophers is really to get more of a general feel for how philosophy is conducted in the pre-Socratic period, right? Next week, we're going to be looking at the Euthyphro, we're going to be looking at the Apology, right? And in doing so, we're going to see an abrupt shift, right? We're starting to read Plato for the first time, and philosophy starts to look a lot different, essentially right when we get to that point, right? We move from the sort of fragmentary analyses of the nature of fundamental reality, right? For Heraclitus, a lot of this was centered around physis as an idea, right? Nature. And to be wise is to know nature, right? To reflect on it, to understand it. And so, in general, you might characterize the pre-Socratics as philosophers who were attempting, in one way or another, to discover the principal element of the universe, right? And hence we get a lot of the sort of characterizations that we've discussed up to this point, like how I've written right here on this left half of the board, right? That Thales believes that the fundamental nature of reality is water, right? And Heraclitus thinks the fundamental nature of reality is fire, and so on and so forth, right? When we start reading Plato, things are really going to shift, right? And how are things going to shift? Well, we're no longer reading fragments. Now we're reading complete works, right? We're going to be looking at dialogues. They're often going to be something in the rough area of like 30-ish pages, right? And so it's a lot more sustained form of inquiry than we've really followed so far, right? Maybe some of the most sustained kinds of arguments that we've seen were in like Parmenides' poem, for example. But now we're not writing in verse, right? This is no longer a poem, right? This is now a completely different genre than what was happening before. And in particular, Plato wrote in dialogues, right? Plato doesn't have anything like what we've seen from the pre-Socratics, where Plato just sort of says something like, I think that reality is like this, right? And then gives one of the answers that we've seen sort of the pre-Socratics giving in various ways, right? Instead, the way that Platonic dialogues work is that it's a constant process, right? So rather than just going outright and saying, what you think the answer to certain kinds of questions are, to the contrary, Plato stages a sort of debate, dialogue, interaction, etc., usually between his mentor, Socrates, and someone else, very often a kind of challenger to Socrates in one way or another, right? And so that is way more complex, right, as a kind of way of presenting and doing philosophy. Plato can be very hard to interpret and understand, right? Because you might think like, okay, Socrates just kind of like says all the wise stuff, right, for Plato. But, to what extent does that really reflect the actually historically existent Socrates? We don't really know, right? We don't have that much evidence about Socrates or really many of the people that Plato decided to write about in his various dialogues. But we do have independent evidence that like Socrates existed, right? He wasn't just an invention that Plato made up in his mind, and there really was this sequence of events that we're going to be discussing for the next several weeks that is sort of like the trial and death of Socrates, right? And so we're going to get a really firm but also foundational sort of introduction to the nature of Socrates, Plato, and Platonic dialogues, right? And the purpose of covering the Presocratics is not really to give an exhaustive analysis of what they say. Many of us just aren't in the position to do that, right? But instead, our goal is to have enough of a sense for what philosophy is like before Plato, Socrates, etc., to get some sort of appreciation for how the transformation takes place, right? So you don't need to be really stressing like, oh, I need to remember what specifically Anaximander said versus Anaximenes versus, oh, this is the Parmenides argument for the one versus Melissus, etc., right? Those details are interesting and could be really interesting if you decide that you want to write about them in the future, but it's not the expectation for this class, right? The expectation is that you get sort of like a general feel for how philosophy is done, right? So we did our, kind of more deep dives into Heraclitus and Parmenides, but for many other of these figures, it's really sufficient that you have, sort of a cursory understanding of their views, right? In part because we don't really have that much more than a cursory understanding of their views. So the purpose of this lesson is not really to give you a further deep dive into any of these figures, but to, in a very loose way, just kind of discuss like the form that philosophy took in ancient Greece, outside of Athens, before Athens is really, the central hub where philosophy is done, so that then we can appreciate the transformation that takes place within Athens, right? So let's start talking about it. Let's move to this first left half of the board, right? So on the left here, right, I've just written out various elements that are proposed by one of the philosophers that we discussed, right? And then I also put the philosopher, right? So Thales famously claimed that all things were water, right? Heraclitus similarly claimed that our cosmos is an eternally burning fire, right? And Anaximenes said that the fundamental nature of reality is air, right? Because air is gaseous and boundless, right, in nature. Most people are, if you're taking this class, indoctrinated in one way or another into kind of like Western culture, right? So you're probably familiar with this idea of like the elements, right? There is earth, fire, air, and water, right? And these idea of the four elements really has these ancient Greek philosophical roots, right? It's interesting that we don't really see, at least to my knowledge, a pre-Socratic claim that earth is the fundamental element, right? Why do they tend not to claim that earth is a fundamental element? Well, if you scoop up a bit of soil, right, and you look at it, then you're likely to notice, right, that it contains some degree of moisture content, right? And so what the ancient Greeks inferred from that is like, oh, well, Earth must already, to some extent kind of be a composite, right? And so a lot of the opening pre-Socratic philosophers are giving various cases for why each of these elements could perhaps plausibly be construed as the nature of fundamental reality, right? And they all have at least something to say for them, right? So like water, for example, that might sound like an absurd thesis, like we're all made of water and we're all in water now, right? Or something like that. But remember, one reason why Aristotle wanted to give Thales a lot of credit is because Thales noted that water is in everything that lives, right? Everything that's alive that human beings can find has water, right? Needs water. And so that inference, we might say is imperfect and doesn't stand up to our own contemporary scientific scrutiny, right? But for working almost 3,000 years in the past and, having, none of the cultural, scientific, etc. achievements that we have now, that's pretty good, right? It's pretty good. Similarly with fire, right? Am I on fire right now? I don't know, right? But what Heraclitus really says when he says that the world, the cosmos, is an eternally burning fire, right? Kindled in measures and extinguished in measures, right? Everything is a constant process that is, changing constantly. We say a fire, the fire, like it's one singular thing that's like the same over time, but really, from this sort of Heraclitean perspective, it's about a process, right? A constant fundamental change, right? And we discussed some pretty, compelling reasons for why you might think that's the nature of reality. And then we get air from Anaximenes, right? Air is a gas, right? It can take on any form that a container it's placed in, right? And so this idea of air as formlessness, right? You can then see how, through, I don't know, compacting it or something like that, it can come to take on the more specific forms, of the other elements, right? So all of these classical accounts have at least something to say for them, right? They propose these elements as the basic stuff of the universe, right? So Thales thinks that even earth and air and fire, right, are water, in various forms, right? Just as steam is like gaseous water, right? And so on and so forth. And so those are some of the most basic accounts that we start to see, right? This is the basic stuff of the universe. Before moving on to these, I would describe them as slightly more sophisticated accounts below, right? One position that you might have, which is the position that Empedocles takes, that we examined for this week, is that Empedocles thinks there's not just one element, right? But there's actually 4 elements, right? Fire, water, earth, and air, right? Neither of them make each other, right? These are all the basic stuff of the universe. You need all of them, right? And according to Empedocles, right, these elements engage in certain kinds of relations, right, that he calls love and strife, right? So maybe, water and earth in a relation of harmony, right, of love, come together and they begin to form like soil or something like that, right? Similarly, a tree on fire produces smoke, it produces kind of air, right? And so on, right? And so Empedocles sort of adds to these basic accounts, right? Not only by saying, hey, like, let's say that all of these basic I don't know, elements are the stuff of the universe, but then also let's pay more attention, examination to the relation that they take with one another, right? So like fire can burn up water, right, and make it into air. That might be a way that fire and water combine that produces strife, right? It produces a sort of conflict where neither of the elements can survive, right? And from this, Empedocles can get like a very sort of complex picture of the universe. And it's in particular by focusing on this idea of the relations between various elements that perhaps this sort of like second tier, I separated them with this pink line, of positions can also sort of be appreciated, right? One thing that the Pythagoreans might say, looking at Empedocles or looking at these other pre-Socratic philosophers, right, is that you're attempting to provide something like an account, a logos, right, of the absolute, of the nature of reality, right? And so you think that you've gotten all of the elements and the relations, right? But what about number? What about the fact that things are not merely related like causally, right? In terms of, chemical processes or however we might describe love and strife today, but also that things enter into numerical relationships with one another as well, right? And the Pythagoreans noticed, and give them credit, they're right about this, right? That we'll never get the relationship of number, right, simply from looking at the elements as the other pre-Socratics understood them, right? So the Pythagoreans, you can think, sort of mount a fundamental criticism of these earlier pre-Socratic thinkers. Similarly to Parmenides also offers a challenge to them, right? And that challenge is a kind of radical form of monism, right? Against the Empedocles sort of position where there are 4 elements, right? Parmenides would ask, like, what is it that causes the breaks in reality that makes them come into elements, right? Why think that there are elements in the sense of like the smallest indivisible components of reality, right? Why think that reality even comes into parts, right? Isn't what reality fundamentally one in the first place, right? And so, in a way, Parmenides and Parmenidean philosophy proposes a fundamental challenge to these other accounts, right? It proposes a challenge to the sort of like traditional elements accounts, because the elements accounts proposes some sort of change, right? How does water become my body? How does water become fire? How does water become a tree, right? All of these things that we see in our everyday reality. And the answer, it seems, that needs to be given by the pre-Socratics is, well, there's change, right? And then Parmenides is going to ask, well, how do you explain those changes? And then finally, another account that I think is worth discussing is atomism, right? We're actually going to have an opportunity to discuss ancient Greek atomism in a more thorough way later on, because we're going to be talking about like maybe the most sophisticated atomist, ancient Greek philosopher named Epicurus, later on in the semester, right? But one thing that's really interesting about the atomists in this context, specifically think about Leucippus and Democritus, right, is that they respond to this kind of Parmenidean challenge, right? Parmenides says, well, Parmenides asks us to explain how it is that there could ever be more than one element, right? And in particular, Parmenides and Zeno seek to disprove the reality of motion, right? By disproving the reality of what is not, right? Now, the atomists, to the contrary, they actually think what is not really exists, right? They take up the Parmenidean challenge in a very direct way. Parmenides says you cannot speak of what is not, right? Nothing true can be said about it, and so on, right? Whereas the atomists, to the contrary, maintain actually the universe is composed of 2 basic things: you might think of them as something, right? Atoms, these things that are the smallest components of all the big things that make up my everyday reality, right? And void being the location that they come to occupy, right? And sort of inverting these Parmenidean arguments, the atomists assert, well, you need void to exist. Why? Because if void did not exist, then motion would be impossible, right? So in some ways they're taking up but also directly challenging many of Parmenides' arguments about what is not, right? So to move to this other side, right? Atomism proposes actually two elements, right? Atoms are not like our natural scientific conception of atoms where they have a proton, neutron, and electron, but actually where that scientific conception of atoms comes from, which is this ancient Greek idea of something being indivisible, right? In atom, right? Here, once again, we have the alpha privative, right? And tome is to cut, right? So an atom is that which is uncuttable, right? It's that reality that is the smallest component of all the visible stuff that we see, right? That cannot be divided any further, right? So to conclude, you can see how how Empedocles begins to open up and explicitly reflect on the relations between the elements that he proposes, right? And you can also see in this strain of sort of later pre-Socratic thought an increasing emphasis on this idea of relationships, right? Where the Pythagoreans think that relations are numerical, the Parmenideans think that relations don't exist because there is only the one, right? The what is not is not. And finally, the atomists are the first to really start thinking about what we might call mereological relationships. I'll write that word down. Which just means relationships having to do with wholes and parts, right? The atoms are the parts of, say, the pens and papers and whiteboards and computers and so on that we see, and they constitute the fundamental reality. So, to wrap things up, we can really say, I believe, quite safely, that the pre-Socratics were, for the most part, concerned with metaphysical questions, right? And to say something is a metaphysical question is to say that it asks about the stuff that physics normally leaves unexplained, right? What is motion? What is it? What is something to mean for it to be there? What is the basic stuff of the universe? How many of them are there, right? What relationships do they enter into? In these questions about fundamental reality that we can't set up an experiment to really test, but instead are like the presuppositions of our experiments, are the central object of concern for the pre-Socratics. What we're going to see in Socrates, beginning in the Euthyphro, right, is a shift in orientation away from these sort of questions of natural philosophy, the being of nature, into explicitly moral, political, ethical questions, right? It's not what is fundamental reality, right? Although Plato tries to answer that question as well. But instead, it's more like, what is a life worth living, right? How do we know that we're living a worthwhile life? These sort of ethical and political problems come to take the fore. I hope that you've really enjoyed reading these pre-Socratics. I know that I really enjoyed being able to do this, and I look forward to our next video. I hope you're doing well. Bye.